Good afternoon to everyone on the line. We're going to give folks about one more minute. All right, let's get going. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If somebody's on the phone, if you could please mute your phone to avoid that. Perfect. Nope. So welcome to the June edition of the Northwest Gas Association webinar. I'm sorry, guys. I'm trying to figure out where that noise is coming from. If somebody is dialed in through a phone, please mute your phone. Testing. Okay, I think we've got that figured out. Sorry about that, everyone. Welcome again to the June edition of the Northwest Gas Association webinar. My name is Connor Wrighton, and I'm with the Northwest Gas Association. And today we're going to be joined by Steve Jones from ITM Power, who's going to be discussing power to gas and how the process of turning excess renewable energy into hydrogen can help us use existing gas infrastructure to support the grid. This is a subject that we've heard quite a bit about over the past year or so, and we look forward to continuing to learn about this technology and the role that it can play going forward. But before we begin, let's review the basics for how these webinars work. We've set aside some time for questions, and we strongly encourage you to ask them as they come up. Each of you will be muted throughout the presentation, so please use the text box to type your questions, and I will interject as needed to introduce the questions, though we will probably wait till the end to get to most of those. Steve has given us permission to convey a PDF copy of this presentation for those of you who ask for it. You can do that by sending an email to me at creiten@nwga.org or by responding to the email that I sent out with the sign-in details this morning. As some of you may know, the Northwest Gas Association hosts webinars like these each month. We do not currently have a speaker lined up for July 20th, but we are in the process of scheduling one, and we'll be in touch soon to let you know who that will be. Though we do know that will occur on July 20th, and so we encourage you to mark that off on your calendar. I'd also like to thank all of you who attended our 14th Annual Energy Conference a couple of weeks ago at Skamania. It was a wonderful event, and we are already looking forward to next year's 15th annual event, which will take place on the 6th and 7th, again at Skamania Lodge. So again, we encourage you to mark off those dates on your calendar because we look forward to seeing you then. Finally, I'd like to introduce the Northwest Gas Association for those of you who might not be familiar with us and what we do. We represent the 6 investor-owned gas utilities operating in the Pacific Northwest, along with the 3 natural gas pipelines that connect them. Our members are located in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. And as always, please visit our website at nwga.org for more information. And without further ado, I'm going to pass things along to Steve. All right, Steve, we can see that, but we can't hear you so far.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that introduction. So welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Jones. I'm the Managing Director of ITM Power. We are primarily an electrolysis manufacturer and hydrogen systems developer. I'm going to talk to you today about power to gas and how using renewable electricity to generate hydrogen and then use that hydrogen for various things within the energy sector. So just as a general introduction, we're talking today to a US and Canadian audience. Power to gas energy storage really has its origins in the European market, and so a lot of the slides that you see and a lot of the information that I pull into some of those slides, some of it is from the US, but I will bounce back and forth between Europe and the US because there's a lot more data in Europe. You know, this is going to draw on some of that experience that we've got in Germany and the UK predominantly. So I'm going to start to talk about the electrical network, what it is, how curtailment and storage are affecting what's happening these days, how the electrical side of things is changing, and how do we balance that network? How do we look to electrify energy a little bit more? How do we deal with the interruptions of renewable energy? And how can we store that energy? And specifically, how can we store it as hydrogen? And then once we've got the hydrogen, what can we do with it? Why is it helpful? Why is it a good thing to consider for the future energy networks? So the need and the reason that we're doing a lot of this is because of graphics like the one that you can see here. So this is showing the increase in renewable energy in the US, largely dominated by wind and solar, as you can see. Biomass and geothermal are in there as well. This particular graph doesn't have hydropower on there. I know that the Northeast area is rich in hydro energy, but of course the hydropower is also affected by what's happening around the world in terms of climate change. You know, for example, I'm based in California. You know, they're predicting a lot more energy from hydro this year because of the increases in rainfall that we've had, and that's actually going to cause more curtailment because the hydro is going to be taking the place of some of this wind and solar that's been deployed. I think the take-home message is that as we start to see this increase, you arrive at a law of diminishing returns. So if you can't store that energy for every wind turbine you put up, for every solar panel you put down, you're going to get less and less useful energy from that device. And it's really because, you know, we're getting more and more renewable energy on the grid. I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with the famous duck curve in California, looking at the dramatic increase in solar power in the state and how that affects the net load on the grid, and how more predominantly this neck of the duck between the sort of late afternoon, early evening, when the sun is going down and the demand for energy is going up, is causing some real problems on the grid. And you know, there's a lot of people thinking about how can we store that energy and make the electricity grid more flexible. So renewable energy is a growing occurrence. We need storage. We need different types of storage. We need short-term storage for a couple of hours. We need long-term storage. Hydrogen energy storage is really beneficial when you're looking at large amounts of energy storage, so gigawatt hours of energy storage, and for long periods of time. So you might be looking at seasonal shifts of storage, particularly if you're looking at renewable heat, for example. It might be the energy might be generated in the summer. You might want to use the energy in the winter. And so that long-term energy storage and large volume energy storage is really only achievable with technologies like hydrogen. And I'm going to talk to you about some studies that have been done in the past that really demonstrate that. So, for example, in California, in March 2017, California curtailed 85 gigawatt hours of energy, largely on an economic basis. Having a low-cost energy sink can allow you to capture that energy. So why are they doing it? You know, I'm sure most of you on the phone, you know, it's an educated audience, so you understand this type of thing. A lot of the standard baseload energy generation plants are not very flexible. They don't like to be turned up and down. They're pretty baseload plants. And so when you get wind and solar coming in to the energy mix, a lot of the time it's more economical to curtail the renewable electricity, keep the fossil fuel energy going at base load, and just simply waste that energy. And what that ends up doing to the power price is you start to see these dips in power. So they tend towards zero. And actually in Europe, it's increasingly common to see negative powers. So they're actually paying people to take the power off the grid because they have this excess. This graph here is done by NREL in the US by a guy called Josh Eichmann. He was looking at different amounts of renewables. So the green line is when you get to 33% renewables. The purple line is when you get to 40% renewables. And looking at the average energy price across the day, this was specific for California, but other areas will show similar graphs as you start to get more and more renewables on the grid. This is another example from the UK. This is about the value of balancing the grid. So if you can be a flexible load, if you can absorb load, if you can release load on demand whenever the grid wants you to do it, you can actually receive revenue for that. And this is the amount of money that was paid in the UK for grid balancing services. So you can see, you know, we're up into the billions of pounds sterling. You know, 1.5 billion US, you know, as this graph tends in one direction. So talk about power to gas. So we've got this energy excess that's being apparent in various areas of the world. And we talk about power to gas. You know, what does power to gas mean? So this diagram up here displays it quite well, I think, in that you have the purple lines which represent the electricity sector, whether that's wind, solar, whether it's the grid, you know, whatever it is on this left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, in the orange lines, you have the gas network. So you have this huge amount of energy store that's available. And the thing that links the two is the yellow box in the middle there, which is the electrolysis unit, which is the technology that ITM focuses on. So what that electrolysis unit does, it uses renewable energy to split water into its constituent parts, hydrogen and oxygen. Then you can do a number of things with the hydrogen once you've produced it. You can either directly inject hydrogen into the natural gas pipelines, which is what we're doing in Europe. You can use the hydrogen, combine it with a waste CO2 source from an industrial process or a brewery, cement factory, whatever it might be, and you can actually use that hydrogen and CO2 to create synthetic methane CH4 and then use it as you would a normal renewable gas. Or you can take the hydrogen directly and you can use it as a clean fuel in a fuel cell vehicle. So here in California, you know, there's 60 fuel cell vehicle stations being built. There's over 2,000 hydrogen vehicles on the road today in California, and that number is growing year on year. Looking at energy storage, different types of energy storage. If you go, this is a log scale, so it's looking at discharge time along the vertical axis and actually the amount of storage in megawatts and gigawatts and terawatt hours. And as you can see, you know, if you're storing small amounts of energy for small periods of time, flywheels and batteries, that's the technology to use. And so a lot of this short-term energy storage that's being deployed today is using that technology, and rightly so. But as you start to have to store more energy in terms of gigawatt hours, terawatt hours of energy, and you have to store it for longer periods of time, that's when you get up into this upper right-hand side where power to gas, hydrogen power to gas, and also synthetic natural gas production, methanation, start to come into play. And just as an example, it's not quite apple to apples, but it gives a good sense of what we're talking about here. This is looking at battery storage versus hydrogen storage, and it's looking at lithium ion versus a power to gas system. And there's a lithium ion storage system, which is 8 megawatts with a 4-hour duration, so it's a 32 megawatt hour storage facility, and it works out at around $1.67 million per megawatt hour. If you were to do that same amount of energy storage with power to gas over the 4-hour duration, because you buy the equipment and you store the energy somewhere else, the cost comes down to $0.67 million per megawatt hour. But the beauty about a power to gas system is that you can run it for 4 hours, or you can run the same plant for 12 hours. The CapEx doesn't change. It's the same physical amount. It's the storage that changes, which in this case is the gas grid. So a little bit like hydro energy, you can think about the size of the pump and then the size of the lake. Same thing with power to gas. So you're separating the power from the energy to get those costs right down. So when you're talking about long-term energy storage, it really starts to make economical sense. So the elements of value really with power to gas are multifaceted. They have value to the power grid to avoid curtailment of renewables, avoided infrastructure upgrades to move power around, and obviously reducing the overall CO2 footprint of the system. Value to the gas grid. Obviously, if you're introducing renewable gas into the grid, you're decarbonizing that gas network. You're providing renewable heat, and obviously the emissions from all of the gas transportation side of things are going to be reduced as well. And then obviously, if this thing is implemented in grid scale, you have the economic values of reducing fuel imports, improving energy security, and obviously the jobs that come along with something like this. So we know that there's a need for energy storage. We know that there's a way of storing that energy as a gas and moving it into a different sector, which is the gas network. So can we do it? What's the compliance look like? And this is looking at how much hydrogen are you allowed to inject into a natural gas pipeline in different areas of the world. And as you can see, the UK, the US are right on the left-hand side, less than 1%. And you see Germany over there, which is where most of this is happening, is up at 10% at the moment. Now, the reason for that is not a safety one. It's more a historic one. Nobody's really looked at this before. Nobody's really had to do this before. And so what they're trying to do is ensure that the natural gas that's in there is as pure as possible. And so hydrogen is often thought of as an impurity, particularly in areas like the UK where we import a lot of the natural gas. So it's not really a safety concern. There's a couple of studies that I'm putting on the screen here. This is a UK study that says as long as you keep below 20% by volume of hydrogen in the natural gas stream, it doesn't have any downstream effects on process plant, burners, cookers, gas turbines, whatever might be downstream. If you're keeping below that 20% by volume, doesn't really make any difference. And that same thinking was validated by NREL. NREL did a study about blending hydrogen into natural gas pipelines, what the issues were. And again, not really a safety concern. Areas like Hawaii already have 10% hydrogen in their natural gas pipeline system because it's a naphtha-based system. So they already operate with 10%. Areas like the UK many years ago had a town gas system, which was which had a lot of hydrogen in it, and there were no safety issues. So it's not really a safety thing, it's more a procedural thing that we need to look at. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about how some of these things have been deployed and where they've been deployed. Physical hardware on the ground that's been operating for many years. So this unit was our first power to gas project. It was actually the first power to gas project using a PEM electrolyzer in Germany. It was about 4 years ago now. And what this unit does, it injects hydrogen directly into the natural gas pipeline system. It does it on a daily basis. This unit runs on and off depending on how the power operator wants to operate it in response to what's going on in the grid. And you know, this is an example from our customer of what this unit is doing. So you can see it's being ramped on, it's being ramped off, it's turning on and off sub-second, it's doing very rapid modulation in load, which is what the power guys want you to do if you're going to be considered a responsive load for grid firming, grid balancing, and renewable integration. This is another system which is deployed in Germany. This one is slightly different because we're also doing some waste heat recovery from the system. So we're pushing our efficiency from around 70% up to 86% as our system efficiency in this unit. And again, it's being operated over a wide pattern of variability and load. This is the inside of one of the gas mixing plants. So this is essentially a side stream from the main gas pipeline, comes up into this container. The hydrogen is blended in this instance to keep the Wobbe index the same. And then it rejoins the pipeline at a later date. And because the fact that the natural gas pipeline system is such a huge energy reservoir, even though you're having to stick below 20% by volume to inject the hydrogen into these pipelines, it's actually gigawatt, terawatt hours worth of electrical energy that you can store because the gas network is so huge. And for that reason, this is an example of one of the largest systems that we've designed for a potential customer in Europe, looking at a 100 megawatt electrolysis load. So this is 100 megawatts of electrical energy in a dedicated facility, looking at storing this gas and injecting it into the natural gas pipeline system. So in Germany, there are over 20 active power to gas hydrogen energy storage projects at the moment, doing a variety of things from straight injection like the ones I was just talking to you about, and also synthetic methane production, combining the hydrogen with CO2 to make synthetic methane. And you know, every year there's more and more of these facilities popping up. Not only in Germany, we've just signed the first deal in the UK to do some power to gas energy storage. There's just been a huge 100 megawatt order in France to store energy as hydrogen in the natural gas pipeline system as well. And there are large groupings of utilities coming together specifically with the aim of power to gas. So this is a large grouping of utilities and end users and also manufacturers of equipment in Germany. It has an official tie to the government, and this is the largest power to gas grouping globally. A couple of examples of studies that have been done. So this is an example of a European study that was done looking at long-term energy storage. So, you know, we need loads of energy storage. How are we going to do it? What technology are we going to use? How are we going to store the energy? How are we going to transfer the energy? And this was looking at everything from flywheels and batteries to pumped air storage. And it was looking specifically at some of the requirements of the German network. And what it concluded was that initially, in order to store large amounts of energy. 46 gigawatts of electrolysis would be required by 2030, and that number would rise to up to 170 gigawatts of electrolysis by 2050. So as you can see, when we get into the larger amounts of renewables, a much more renewable network, the amounts of electrolysis start to rise quite considerably. And it's done purely on an economic basis. So this is the economic analysis of storing energy versus some of the other technologies that you can use. So a bit close to home in the US, some of you may be aware of this initiative. This is called H2 at Scale. It's a DOE-backed initiative, and it's looking at what the future energy system of the US could look like if we keep putting more and more renewable energy onto the network, and how hydrogen can play a role in that. So it's looking at the role of hydrogen both for powering vehicles, but also making synthetic fuels, doing a whole host of other industrial and chemical processes with hydrogen, along with power generation. So it's looking at true energy storage, taking electrons, making hydrogen, storing hydrogen, and making electrons again. And they're predicting four quads of energy, so 8 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent of hydrogen demand by 2050. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the other applications, some of the kind of bolt-on additional things that you can do with hydrogen once you've made it. So you've stored the energy, you've made the hydrogen. I've talked about how you can inject it directly into the pipeline, but this is the methanation step. So the dotted box is what we've just talked about. So it's actually making the hydrogen. And what we're doing is using a process called methanation, is we're combining the hydrogen with a source of CO2, a waste source of CO2, or a carbon capture source to make synthetic CH4 methane, which can then be used as a direct substitute for natural gas. Also, there are projects looking at how can we increase the yield of biogas. So where most of you know biogas, anaerobic digestion, or other types of biogas production are normally a 60-40 split of methane and CO2. So what this is looking at doing is targeting that CO2, combining it with hydrogen in a methanation step, and increasing the yield of biogas. So there's been projects that have shown that you can take say a 35% CO2 stream from an anaerobic digestion facility, and you can increase the yield up to 95+% of biogas and decrease the yield of CO2 using this process. Another way that you can use hydrogen is in renewable ammonia production. So ammonia is a huge market. It takes up a lot of the existing hydrogen production capacity worldwide. It's responsible for 5% of the world's natural gas consumption, because you make so much of it from so much of the hydrogen from natural gas. But you can use renewable energy at a distributed scale to generate renewable ammonia. We have a couple of pilot projects looking at this technology. You can also, using a similar method, make renewable urea. So again, with the agricultural industry, it's a huge industry for fertilizer production. We have a project looking at making renewable urea. And once you get to this stage, methanol, urea, you can go right the way up to even jet fuel. There's a customer that I'm talking to at the moment, which is looking at producing jet fuel using a renewable hydrogen stream. And also biomass. There's a company that we know in Vancouver in Canada called G4, who have a process whereby they make renewable natural gas from biomass, so woody biomass, forest waste, and in conjunction with hydrogen, you can make large amounts of renewable natural gas, this method as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you use hydrogen in vehicles. So, you know, a lot of the talk about hydrogen is about fuel cell vehicles, particularly in areas like Japan, Germany, and California, where zero-emission vehicles are being put on the roads. And you can have a combined plant. Sorry. So when we're making large amounts of hydrogen, we could be doing energy storage, we could be putting it into a pipeline system, but at the same time, we can be using some of that hydrogen directly to fuel vehicles. And so, you know, the natural gas industry is a feedstock already for CNG vehicles, public fleets of CNG buses and things like that that are taking the gas directly out of the pipeline, compressing it up on site and using it to fuel vehicles. By the same token, those vehicles could be hydrogen vehicles. And the benefits of a hydrogen vehicle is that obviously the emissions are water vapor, so it's a zero emission vehicle. And you can have a combined plant where you're doing energy storage into the pipeline, but you're also putting hydrogen into vehicles, a little bit like this description that I'm showing on screen now. Hydrogen vehicles are a growing topic of discussion. Almost every major vehicle manufacturer around the world has committed to producing a hydrogen vehicle line. Today, we have Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai as the vehicle manufacturers which have publicly available passenger vehicles, but all the rest will come online between now and 2020. And then, of course, we also have a lot of hydrogen-powered heavy-duty vehicles, so buses and trucks and delivery vehicles, all looking at how they can get to zero emissions, but still retain the long range and the short fueling duration that you get with a gasoline vehicle. So an example of this is a few of the hydrogen refueling stations that we've deployed in the UK. We have a deal with Shell to site hydrogen refueling stations on Shell property in the UK using electrolysis. We have four stations at the moment, with another 12 being planned. This is another station that we have in California. So this is based in Riverside in California. Again, it's using electrolysis to make hydrogen and refueling the public vehicles. There's about 2,000 publicly owned hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in California at the moment, and that number is set to rise to, I think, around 6,000 by the end of this year, and scaling from there. So I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about ITM. So I purposefully haven't started the presentation with a pitch about ITM, because I wanted to talk to you more about the technology and about what the capabilities are. But I wanted to put a couple of slides about the company. ITM Power is a UK headquartered company. We have subsidiary offices in Germany and California. We were actually the first hydrogen fuel cell company that was floated on the London Stock Exchange. We have, that number's actually slightly out of date, we have around 80 staff today. And we're seeing global growth year on year of this technology. And, you know, that's partially just because of the technology itself. You know, it's good, robust, reliable technology, but also it's the market. So we're seeing a big market transformation in the last few years. So this is just an example of some of the things that happened last year. So this is 2016. We've seen 100% growth in the orders year on year for the past 2 years now. And if the first half of this year is anything to go by, we'll be actually exceeding that target for next year. But most people in the hydrogen industry, most of the companies in the hydrogen industry could show a similar slide to this. And so it really is we are seeing a large uptick in the market pull for this type of technology as we go year on year. So in summary, I just wanted to pull out a few things from the rest of the slides. I know there's a lot of information here, and the slides are going to be made available to you all afterwards, and my contact details are in there. So I'm happy to follow up with you all after the fact with additional information as you digest some of the slides in a bit more detail. But in summary, increased renewable electricity requires large-scale storage, whether that's solar, wind, hydro, whatever it is. As we start to get more and more of it on the network, we're going to need to implement large storage. And grid resiliency is compromised by renewable integration. So as you get more renewable, your grid resiliency is compromised, and that's something that obviously the grid operators want to try and avoid. Power to gas is the energy storage technology that can store vast amounts of energy for long periods of time and do it economically. Power to gas is really the only energy storage technology that links different energy sectors together and allows energy shifting between one sector and the other sector. And so we can simultaneously decarbonize the power sector, the heat sector, the gas sector, and the transportation sector all at the same time by using one type of technology, which is the electrolyzer. Power to gas can also assist biogas projects by increasing the yield of biogas from each particular node by using that hydrogen to create more synthetic methane. Provides a synergistic benefit alongside batteries and other types of energy storage. So short-term, short-duration energy storage is great. Batteries are there, they can do that load, but using a holistic approach to energy storage needs different types of solutions. So, we need batteries, we need pumped hydro, we also need hydrogen and long-term energy storage using an existing asset, which is the gas grid, right? It's bought, it's paid for, it's there. So why not use it? Which is what we're advocating around the world, and is starting to gain some real traction. So that's my final slide. There's my contact details. As I said before, I'm happy to follow up with additional questions either now or after the fact via email or over the phone. I think we've got around 20 minutes or so left today, so I'm happy to get into it with questions if you have any. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. We do have a couple of questions here, and the first one is in regards to injecting the hydrogen into the pipeline and what effects that has on the BTU content of the gas.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So the BTU content of the gas, we're trying to make it as exact as possible. So if you inject below that 20% by volume that I was talking about, really the BTU content and the energy characteristics, flame speeds, flame temperatures, all those kinds of things largely remain unchanged. And so this is why we talk about these limits. And if you go above that, that's when you start to change the characteristics of the gas. And so obviously, if it's a dedicated line that goes from the point of injection to the point of use, and the point of use is okay with higher amounts of hydrogen, that's fine. But if you're just injecting it into a network, which could go to any variety of sources, you need to be a little bit careful and keep below that threshold. But the mixing plants that are being deployed are very sensitive, very accurate in the way that they meter in the hydrogen and mix the hydrogen so that when it leaves, the downstream processes don't really see any difference.
We've got a couple more questions, and both of them have to do with specific examples of how this is being used in North America currently. And the first one of those two questions is, are we injecting these into major transmission lines, or are there examples of us injecting directly into distribution systems?
Yeah, so in the US at the moment, or in North America at the moment, there are two examples of how this technology is being looked at. One of them is in Canada, in the Ontario region. There's a 2 megawatt power to gas plant being put in there, which is doing direct injection, but it's also doing repowering. So there's a fuel cell and some storage, and they're doing electricity in, electricity out energy storage. The more direct injection type approach is a pilot project that's being done in California by UC Irvine in Orange County, where they are using the university has its own kind of microgrid. It has a large amount of solar on the site, and they wanted to increase the amount of solar that they were putting down, and so they installed an electrolyzer, and the electrolyzer actually injects hydrogen into the gas network on the campus, which includes various downstream processes, but it also includes a combined cycle gas turbine for their energy production. So it's a good starting point. That project is being done in collaboration. The major funder for that project is Southern California Gas, and that's a stepping stone to larger deployment of this technology.
Great, I think that takes care of both of those questions. And so we've got another one here about cost impact. And so what is the cost impact and the impact on the conversion efficiency of adding methanation to a storage plant?
Okay, yeah, good question. So obviously there's an additional capex involved in buying that methanation equipment. The benefits of the technology are that for large scale, I mean really large scale energy storage using hydrogen, when you might approach that 20% capacity limit, obviously if you're generating the hydrogen, you're turning it into methane, you can put 100% in. It doesn't matter at that point. Methane is methane. And so the economics of the solution center around the price of electricity for the electrolyzer to make the hydrogen in the first place, and also the CO2 source. Is it a CO2 source where it carries some value? So in certain areas where there's large emitters of CO2 that are being incentivized to reduce the CO2 output, then this is an outlet for them. This is a way of shifting the CO2 rather than emitting it on the site. We're making synthetic methane with it. So the economic argument for this is it's a complex equation. It's quite situation specific. And so for sure there's an additional capex on top because you have to buy the methanation equipment. But a lot of the times, you would only do this in a situation where there was additional revenue sources that made that make sense economically.
Great. So the next question here is, when you inject just hydrogen, are you using the pipeline to piggyback the hydrogen since the heating value doesn't change?
That's correct. So the pipeline, so when you're injecting it in, you're essentially using the pipeline as the transfer mechanism. Was that the question?
I believe so. Steve, if you've got anything more, please type that in and I'll get some clarification. But otherwise, we'll move on here. The next question is that we've heard that hydrogen is a very small molecule and is subject to leakage from the pipelines. How is that issue being dealt with?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm glad that somebody asked this question because although the fundamental physics of the fact that hydrogen is a smaller molecule than methane are correct, the assumption that if you put hydrogen into a pipeline it will leak is actually incorrect. And there's been a couple of studies that have done this, one of which is tied again to the UC Irvine study that I talked about previously, in that they measured their gas network with 100% natural gas, and they measured the natural leakage through valves and stuff like that. You know, that every gas system has an amount of leakage, and then they looked at what it does if you add hydrogen to that mix, and actually they saw no real change in the amount of leakage from the system. So whereas you're looking at, you know, part of it has to do with the age of the gas network that you're injecting into, for sure. But I think the adding small amounts of hydrogen into natural gas and blending it in there doesn't actually increase the amount of leakage.
Great, we've got one more question here. Again, if anybody else has any other questions, we do have some more time, so please type those into the chat function. But I'll read this last one here. How efficiently can the H2 be extracted back out from the gas distribution system? Is it realistic to distribute H2 to auto stations, for example, via mix, distribute, and extract?
Yeah, good question again. And two answers really. One is most of the time, or depending on what your end use is, you don't really care. So once it's in the pipeline, it's energy. It's a straight energy substitution thing, and so it goes and it's used for whatever natural gas is being used for. The other angle is the one that's typed in here. So it's using the pipeline as the transfer mechanism, but then actually what you want out the other end is pure hydrogen again. And there are a number of ways that you can do it. There's a filtration, like a palladium filter mechanism that you can do it. You can actually reform the gas again to extract the hydrogen. And there's actually a couple of other more unique ways of doing it that are currently being developed. So this is a specific unit for this exact process. So using a extraction method of a catalytic extraction method to actually take the hydrogen straight out and leave the gas in there. And so, you know, I think there are a couple of ways that you do it at the moment. Mostly in power to gas applications, they're doing straight energy substitution, so they're not really looking to recapture that hydrogen. But there's a lot of research going on in this exact area. So I think, you know, in 5 years' time, we're going to have methods of extracting the hydrogen from the pipeline again that are cost effective and, you know, an efficient way of doing it. Because if you can use the natural gas pipelines to move hydrogen around for mobility, you know, you've solved one of the biggest issues with hydrogen stations at the moment, which is that moving hydrogen around via road in tankers and stuff, you know, is costly. And if you can piggyback onto an existing pipeline system which is bought and paid for and already under the ground and readily accessible to most fueling facilities, then you know, you can really start to drive the price of hydrogen mobility down.
Got a couple more here. Have you seen any impacts on downstream appliances? And even more, have you seen impacts on storage like LNG or CNG or the materials?
So the answer to both of those questions is no. We haven't seen any impacts on downstream appliances, and that's because we, as an industry, are starting on the cautious side. So we're starting in small volumes, up to 20%, but in most cases we're in that 5% range at the moment. And so there's been a lot of studies done by places like Sandia National Labs up in Northern California, who have a hydrogen materials lab. So they look specifically at real world pipelines, valves, fittings, washers, O-rings, all those kinds of things that are used, and they're looking at what effect does hydrogen have on those? Does it increase the permeation rate? Does it decrease the life of a seal, for example, or a valve or something? And you know, they haven't seen much, to be honest with you. I think they're just confirming that that 20% limit that we're talking about is the right figure. And my personal opinion is that 20% will creep up over time, but it won't creep up very much, just because that you don't want to start changing the flame characteristics and the characteristics of the fuel, because there's always going to be a lot of older technology downstream which has been designed for natural gas. And once you start having to change out downstream equipment, that's when you start to run into real costs, which we want to avoid.
How much does the 100 megawatt plant cost?
Okay, so the 100 megawatt plant is somewhere in the region of $1 million, just under $1 million a megawatt, when you get into that range. So there's been a plant in France that was announced that was around in that 100 megawatt range, and I think that was about 600,000 euros per megawatt. So that was in that 1 million a megawatt is a good ballpark figure for large scale, and that's today. I think once we get volume manufacturing on plants like that, then we'll tend down towards that 600,000 a megawatt range.
All right, we've got one more here, and I'll just read it. Straight energy substitution only occurs when combined with carbon. Otherwise, without downstream hydrogen extraction, it's not creating value. That seems to be a question. Yes.
So can you just read that to me again?
Sure. It says straight energy substitution only occurs when combined with carbon, ? Otherwise, without downstream hydrogen extraction, it's not creating value. Also a question.
Okay. So no, the answer is no. So energy substitution, straight energy substitution, is done with pure hydrogen as well. So the meter cubed or whatever of hydrogen that you're injecting has got an inherent energy value associated with it, and by default, if you're injecting it in, you're substituting that same amount of energy that would be used as natural gas. So you're reducing the amount of natural gas that you're using in the plant. And so we're doing straight energy substitution with pure hydrogen as well. And then the second part of the question was, without downstream otherwise, without downstream hydrogen extraction, it is not creating value. Not really sure I understand the question, but we're effectively, what we're doing here is we're using waste or low-cost electricity, moving it out of the electricity sector into the gas sector, which obviously an amount of energy has a inherent value in that gas sector, and then we're using it in that sector. Depending on where you are in the world, that molecule of renewable gas can be worth the same amount as its fossil fuel counterpart, or it can be worth more. So, for example, in the UK, there's a renewable heat incentive. So if you create a renewable heat fuel, you can actually receive an additional amount of money on top of what the fuel value is, because it's a renewable fuel.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question, and that's how much water will be used for electrolysis under your growth projections, and is water use an issue?
Yeah, good question. Water use is one of the things people think about electrolysis, and they think, oh yeah, it's water. You know, that's bad, particularly in areas like California where there's been a drought for a number of years. But actually, when you start to look at the amount of water that you use to generate hydrogen, it's not actually a lot. And we did a example of if you converted 100% of the passenger vehicle fleet in California and turned it all to hydrogen, which is obviously a stretch, but if you did that, you would increase the amount of water that was consumed by the state by less than 2%. And also, you've got to factor in, and that's not factoring in the fact that all of these vehicles are emitting water vapor from their exhaust. That's not factoring in any kind of equation for how that water might find its way back into the system. But the other thing is using creating hydrogen from electrolysis actually in many circumstances uses less water than the fossil fuel counterpart, because the gasoline production, for example, uses a lot of water, and other ways of producing energy use a lot of water, and so the water production or the water consumption from a hydrogen-based system is really not that significant when you look at the numbers.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for taking the time to do this. This is very interesting, and I really appreciate everyone's questions as well. A lot of good questions, and I encourage you to reach out to Steve if you have any other questions, as well as to go and see a recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel, which you can also request a link to by sending me an email. Thanks again, Steve, and hopefully we'll see everybody back on July 20th.
Yep. Thanks very much. Thank you.